Poor old fool. He has lost his marbles again. A woman snorted, and a man near her added, He should be at the care home. Ernest Blake did not stop. He walked between ranks of people who practiced their sorrow. Medals caught the light and spoke in brittle sounds. He kept his head down, one hand on a folded paper. Uniforms were neat, poppies pinned like tidy promises. Faces looked elsewhere, as if looking could make the past return. He moved closer to the memorial stones. A cadet boy pointed and whispered that old men got lost. His mother shushed him with practiced patience. Ernest moved closer to the wall. He had a slow, measured gait, the sort learned by long marches. On his chest, a row of tarnished medals sat like small moons. He reached the stone and paused, as if reading a language he had learned in his bones. The paper in his hand was soft at the fold. He kept it like a talisman, not the kind you flash, the kind you carry. Inside was a photograph and a name he had said aloud all these years. When the officer announced the list of names, Ernest listened. He touched the stone and ran his finger along engraved letters. He expected to find one more, and he did not. He cleared his throat and spoke, not loud, but with a clarity that made heads turn. "Where is Captain Thomas Hale?" he asked. The question made the order wobble. An aide stepped forward with a smile that tried to be kind and firm. "Sir, perhaps you might like to sit," the aide suggested. Ernest shook his head, and the paper stayed in his hand like a promise. A young woman, Cadet Corporal Emma Wright, noticed him. She had been bored and restless before the names began, following the ritual of the day. Now she watched, because his purpose did not look like confusion. He showed her the photograph. 6 young men in jungle dress, mud on their boots, faces bright with the careless light of youth. On the back, a red circle and a notation, Finch, and a small set of coordinates. He folded the paper as if it might fray away. They told him perhaps a mistake had been made, or records lost to time. They murmured about age and memory. Ernest took none of it as argument. He said, "They buried the operation, not the men." There was no pleading in the words, only the dry tone of someone recounting facts. Emma did not know Finch, and she did not understand why this man looked as though he carried water for a whole village. The officer frowned, and the steward began to edge him away. The crowd resumed its measured grief, their voices like a slow tide. Ernest did not move until he had traced every line on that patch of stone. He paused where a name should have been and did not speak. His hand rested flat, palm against marble, the pressure small but deliberate. Around him people shifted, uncomfortable at the sight of a silence they could not place. Emma stepped closer and offered to help him find the official. "Sir," she said, "I can go and speak with them." He smiled, not at her, but with a tired gratitude. "No," he said softly, "they will not listen to me." He folded the photograph back into the paper and slipped it into his blazer pocket. He straightened his jacket and adjusted the medals like a ritual. He turned his face to the names, and his voice dropped to a private level. "You kept my captain from his name," he said to the stone. His breath came steady, but his eyes had a faraway focus. The officer called for order, urging Emma back to her unit. She hesitated, torn between duty and something that felt more like curiosity. Ernest started to walk away, and then stopped once more. For a long time he stood very still, not looking for help, but listening for an answer that would not come. The folded paper lay against his heart, a compass for a life that refused to let go. When he moved, it was slow and certain, the sort of pace that carries a man to the end of a route he chose himself. As he left, he spoke the name again, softer this time. "Captain Thomas Hale," he said. "Missing, not forgotten." Emma watched him go, and the stone kept the blank where a letter should have been. She found herself repeating the words under her breath, as if saying them might bring the name back to the marble. His figure slipped between groups of people. Only the faint jingle of his medals remained to mark his passage. She stood with the blank space before her and felt the question arrive sharp and new. Who was Captain Hale, And what truth did this old man carry? The question hung, open, and then the crowd folded around other talk and moved on, and waited silently. Ernest Blake approached the pavilion with a soldier's step. The photograph folded in his hand was worn at the creases. Officers watched, polite masks slipping. Colonel Malcolm Reeves saw him and closed his face like a book. Reeves had built a career on control and tidy records. He descended from the platform with measured calm. An aide stepped forward, the ritual of interruption. Reeves stopped the motion with a brief gesture. "What do you want?" he asked. Ernest held the paper like a relic. "I came for Captain Thomas Hale," Ernest said. His voice was thin but clear. The name rang sharp in the hush of the ceremony. Reeves glanced at the photograph, and the sight of the red circle on the back showed in his slack jaw. He had not expected witnesses. "You should not be here," Reeves said. Courtesy shaped as command. The steward spoke of protocol, and people shifted. Old men who remembered too much were a risk. Ernest did not step back. He said, "They buried the mission, not the men." The claim unsettled polite listeners. A whisper moved through the group. Emma Wright, cadet corporal, edged closer and recorded quietly. She had been part of the parade and now watched. Reeves' expression made her keep the device steady. Reeves summoned calm and spoke of security and statecraft. His words were meant to close discussion. Ernest listened like a man who had heard such speeches and kept a ledger of their cost. Then Ernest said, "You signed the orders." The admission landed like a small stone. Reeves' composure faltered. A man from the ministry arrived with a slim folder and spoke of records and chains of custody. He offered to take Ernest into a private room for clarity. Ernest refused. "No private rooms," he said. He wanted truth where people could hear it. He placed his hand on the folder as if testing whether paper could hold consequence. Reeves chose diversion and ordered the steward to escort Ernest away for a health check. It was the maneuver that keeps awkward things manageable. Emma recorded the shift from ceremony to contest. As Ernest moved, he paused and drew out an envelope from his blazer. "Ministry? Restricted?" The stamp read, and Reeves' initials were sealed along the edge. The hush deepened. Reeves muttered about clerical error and similar names, but his voice had a tremor. The envelope was proof that denial might not hold. Emma stepped forward and asked, "Did you sign this?" Reeves gave evasions, and then insisted records were classified. His insistence sounded less like defense and more like fear. Ernest asked for the folder to be opened. The aide hesitated between procedure and a man who would not be moved. He unfastened the folder with a slow, resigned motion. Inside were pages, brittle and precise. Orders, notations, and signatures. A line read like erasure. Emma read aloud, voice small but steady. "Captain Thomas Hale, Operation Finch, removed from public record." The words lifted from paper with a weight that changed the mood. People edged closer, curiosity replacing rehearsed grief. Veterans listened with features drawn. A simple sentence had become accusation. Reeves stood without a defense that reached truth. He spoke of process and review, of protecting lives and ties. The rhetoric sounded like a shield, but the shield had a crack. Ernest said, "You kept my captain from his name." There was no triumph in the voice, only the fatigue of a ledger carried too long. Silence pressed in. The ministerial man spoke of investigations, committees, and redactions, as if procedure could stitch a wound. The crowd's murmur rose, a low, urgent tide. Emma felt the recording vibrate against her palm. Reeves turned and walked away, the part of a man whose career depended on discretion, receding into strategy. He would call meetings, consult lawyers, delay. Delay was a well-known tactic. Ernest did not move after Reeves left. He slid the photograph back into his pocket, fingers lingering on the fold. He said softly, "I will not stop until his name is read." Emma watched and felt an obligation settle in her chest. Listening had made the past present. Around them, people formed uneasy clusters, conversation sharp and new. A reporter at the fringe made a small note, the scrape of points sounding like a promise. The day meant for remembrance had become the start of a question. Ernest remained, a man with a stubborn map tucked against his heart. The photograph felt heavy as truth. The open loop hung between them, waiting for proof or denial. Emma looked at the blank line on the memorial and then at Ernest, who had voiced a name no one else spoke. She felt the pull to follow, to turn curiosity into purpose. The recording tucked into her pocket held what had been said, a dangerous seed. She breathed, steady, firmly. Who was Captain Thomas Hale? What happened at Finch? And why had men of rank chosen to make memory expendable? These were questions moving like ash through the crowd, and they would not fall till answered. Ernest sat with the folder on his knees, the paper whispering with small authority. He had steeled himself for years to speak where witnesses could hear. The photograph lay between his fingers, a compact of names and duty. A clerk read aloud a passage from the file, dry and measured. It listed orders, signatures, and a notation of removal from public record. The words landed and made the air denser. Emma pressed the recorder to her palm and felt its small weight. She listened as the clerk named Operation Finch and the act of erasure that followed. Each syllable changed the balance of the gathering. Reeves folded his hands briefly, the practiced gesture of a man who had governed absence. He said the removal had protected sources and operations. People heard the shape of a defense and waited for its heart. Ernest spoke then, not with heat, but with the steady temper of a man who had kept a ledger of loyalty. He said his captain had led them from danger and then been made invisible to protect a story. The statement was simple and terrible. Reeves offered procedure, committees, and time, words meant to slow the rise of consequence. People nodded, trained to respect process. Ernest would have none of delay. He said that names were not things to be postponed, and that a man may be honored without a hearing. The tone was gentle, but it carried the authority of lived memory. In that firmness, others found courage to speak. A former private came forward and told of a night when Hale had held a light while men climbed to safety. He named small acts that do not appear on official logs. Memory filled the space the file had hollowed. A reporter at the edge of the crowd made a small note, the scrape of points sounding like a promise. The act of writing made the account public, in a way paper had tried to prevent. The audience shifted from ceremony to witness. Reeves's face tightened, and for a moment his reserve faltered. He spoke of national interest and the hard choices it demands. His words had weight, but they did not silence the simple testimonies that followed. Emma stepped forward and asked for Captain Thomas Hale to be read into the public record. Her voice was steady and small, but it carried. The request lodged in the room like a seed. A clerk searched files and found annotations that matched the photograph Ernest held. There was a ministerial stamp and a marginal note explaining removal. The evidence sat between them, plain and obstinate. Veterans told brief stories of Hale's steadiness and the choices made in the dark. Each recollection knitted a small thread back into the fabric of truth. Faces that had been polite now showed recognition. Reeves proposed a review, a process that promised hearings and time. It was a measure crafted to manage consequence. Yet the idea that omission had been possible now stood admitted. Ernest looked at the empty line on the memorial and felt a lightness that surprised him. It was not triumph, only the easing of one weight among many. He asked that the name be placed without prevarication. As the crowd dispersed, a few cadets paused to salute, not a headline, but a man whose name was newly audible. They repeated the name quietly at first, then with a firmness that felt like inheritance. The sound settled along the stone. Ernest returned to his room with the photograph under his shirt, as if to keep the image warm. He moved with a calm that matched the end of a long march. That night, he lay down and did not rise. Emma received a letter next morning, addressed in a hand that had slowed but not softened. She unfolded the paper and found words that asked her to be reckoned with, to speak where he could not. He entrusted her with the photograph and the task. She took the image to the memorial and left it beside the blank line with permission from trustees. The photograph drew attention because it was human and immediate. People looked and asked who the smiling officer was. The ministry issued a brief statement acknowledging an administrative omission and promising review. The statement did not erase the human accounts already spoken. The tangible testimony had moved faster than bureaucracy. Emma kept the file and folded letter in a box with other evidence, and she preserved the recording in case the story needed proving. The archive took one photograph and one voice and made them part of public memory. The ministerial papers remained complex, but one human truth now had a place. The twist was in the quiet economy of his choice. Ernest had planned the last part of his work to happen without him present. He had arranged that the file be seen and the letter delivered, leaving the task to those who would live on. At the dedication, a cadet read Thomas Hale's name aloud, and the sound held as if it had always been there. People leaned forward and listened, as if learning the right shape of regret and repair. The medals on veterans' chests clicked like punctuation. Emma watched and felt the burden of responsibility settle into something like purpose. She thought of a man who had worn silence like an old coat and who finally laid it down in a place where others might take it up. The day closed on that small handover of duty. Such stories outlive the single life and linger. Some heroes never asked for a monument. They carried their duty quietly and left the noise to history. If this story moved you, share it, not for numbers, but for memory, so that another forgotten name might find its way home. This is Quiet Heroes, true stories of courage without applause. Subscribe, stay with us, and keep their voices alive.